Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I am joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, and undercover leather daddy.
Oh, I knew it. I always had my suspicions.
Going undercover as a leather daddy.
I can't wait for so many Al Pacino impressions coming up in this episode.
Crime, and you gotta solve the crime, and then we put the perpetrator in jail.
It's not bad. It's not bad. So why are we doing that? Well, in this season of Awesome Movie Year, we've been talking about the films of 1980, and we're here at our future cult classic episode to cover a film that was quite controversial in its time and maybe remains so, but not as much. I mean, its cult following has built up in a positive way, as we'll talk about. And that film is William Friedkin's Cruising, starring Al Pacino as a cop who goes undercover in the gay leather S&M scene in New York City in order to catch a potential serial killer who has murdered multiple gay men within that scene. And it's a movie that a lot of people were not happy about at the time that it was being made.
And probably there's a good group still not happy about it. But, Josh, this is one of those movies, like when we were planning this season, we all knew, this is one of those movies that for years and years you know about. And then none of us had ever seen it before. And we finally got around to it. But it's interesting because, like I said, it's like it's always there in the ether for film fans.
Yeah, I mean, and when we were planning this season, and I think we had a number of options for this, my feeling was like, we have to talk about Cruising because it's got such a history of controversy, and it's also had such an evolution. When we talk about cult classics, part of the idea is the way that the viewpoint has changed on the movie over the years. And I think a lot of the people, or at least the kinds of people who are unhappy about this film being made, even within that community, a lot of the perspective has changed. And later in the episode, we are going to talk to a gay film critic, a friend of ours, Mike Pravat, who will offer some of that perspective. But first, we can have our clueless straight perspective, because that's what you come to Awesome Movie Year for.
I'm so dumb and straight and white.
Yeah, well... Anyway, Cruising, as we said, was very controversial. It was based on a 1970 novel by Gerald Walker, and also then partially William Friedkin, who also wrote the screenplay in addition to directing, added some elements that were not in the novel, that he was inspired in part by some actual killings that occurred in the New York City gay scene after the novel was published. So sort of a mix of fictional inspirations and real life inspirations there.
Yeah, so Arthur Bell had written a bunch of articles on those killings in the Village Voice. And there's, of course, this incredibly insane story about Paul Bateson. Did you read about that?
Yeah, Paul Bateson, who was an actor in The Exorcist and then was later convicted of murder. And I love this about William Friedkin. He's like, you know what? I know this guy I used to work with who's a murderer, so I'm going to have him be a consultant on my murder movie.
And he was convicted of murdering a film journalist, but there is speculation that he was also one of the killers of these gay men at this time.
Right. And those crimes, those real life crimes, were never solved. And Bateson was never convicted of those, although he was convicted of that other murder. So, which happened before this movie. Like, he was convicted of murder before this movie was made. And Friedkin was like, you know what? Let's see what he has to say about this. And I kind of have to give him respect for that.
Go to the source.
I know this murderer. Jason, if you were friends with a murderer, would you give him a consultant credit on your film?
Josh, I would have to go down my list of friends, but I bet you there's a murderer in there somewhere.
Good to know. I'll never meet any of those people. Anyway, so Cruising, I mean, despite all of these protests, Arthur Bell, the journalist that you mentioned, was sort of a leading force in protesting this film with his articles that he wrote in the Village Voice, objecting to the potential content of this film. And he rallied a lot of people in the gay community in New York City to go where the film was being shot and to attempt to disrupt it by making noise and things like that, so it would be more difficult to film the movie. On the other hand, Friedkin, I think, and other people have said that actually a lot of people in the gay community were supportive. They shot at actual gay clubs. Many of the extras were people who were patrons of those clubs and were happy to participate. So even at the time, I think there's sort of a mixed response to whether this is a movie that the community wants to support or not.
It's strange to me because Friedkin directed The Boys in the Band. Have you ever seen that film?
I have not, but I am familiar with it. I mean, it's based on a play. There was a remake of it, I think, fairly recently, I want to say.
I think you're right.
One of the earliest plays and then one of the earliest movies to depict gay life.
Yeah, so this whole protest against Friedkin, and I think Mike will get more into it about kind of but the atmosphere around it. But Friedkin did have a track record of treating material like this with its due respect and, trying to make it as a piece of art as opposed to just something controversial.
Right. And I honestly, we'll talk about this more, but I think that's what he's aiming to do here. I don't think Friedkin is one of these filmmakers who's like a provocateur and just decided, oh, I'm going to make this movie so that it can be controversial and push people's buttons and whatever. I really don't think that that's what he's aiming to do here. And I think that he's been vindicated in a lot of ways over the years. But certainly at the time, there were a lot of objections. On the other hand, when the movie finally did come out, after also having to cut 40 minutes of footage in order to get an R rating, footage that Friedkin has said is basically all explicit sexual content that takes place in these clubs. We'll never really know for sure because that footage has been lost and he's never been any really more specific about what it is. But when it was released with this R rating, it did gross $19.8 million on its budget of $11 million. So it wasn't a giant failure, even though it wasn't a big success either.
And Josh, some of those cuts, not just of the sex, but of Pacino's character watching that. So, maybe it added some layers of depth there because, as we'll get into, the ending is androgynous or that's not the word I'm looking for,
No,
Josh.
That's not the word at all. It's ambiguous is maybe the word you're looking for.
There are androgynous characters in this film, but
yes,
the ending is ambiguous, is what I meant to say. 50 recuts to get it to an R, Josh.
Yeah, it's crazy. And yet, it's still, even now, we think of movies. I think a lot of times we look back on movies, from 1980 or from these past years that were, rated in that way. And we think, oh, this seems so tame from our perspective. But this movie really doesn't seem particularly tame, I think, from our perspective.
I know. When I saw that, he had to leave stuff out, I was like, I thought it was pretty explicit as it was. And, portrayed a very specific subculture, which is the point of it. Friedkin said of those cuts, it has mysterious twists and turns, which the film no longer takes.
Right. So whether that would have clarified the plot or not, which was something that, as much as the controversy, critics, I think, really focused at the time on the ambiguity of the plot that they did not care for. And it was nominated for, we've talked a lot weirdly about the Razzies this season. Many movies that we've talked about this season ended up Razzie nominated at the first.
Well, wasn't this the first Razzies? Isn't that what you said?
Yes, it was the first ever Razzies. But I feel like we often end up talking about that when we do our flop episode. But this is, I want to say this is at least the third movie that we've talked about this season.
Fourth.
Yeah, possibly even the fourth that was nominated for Razzies. It was nominated for Worst Picture, Worst Director, and Worst Screenplay at the Razzies. And it was basically torn apart by critics. I didn't really find any mainstream critics who liked this movie. It got 2 thumbs down from Siskel and Ebert, and Siskel was especially harsh about it. And they really, again, far more than the controversy, I think, from mainstream critics, they focused on the idea that it was too ambiguous, that they didn't understand the plot, that there wasn't a clear answer about who is the killer and why, and that they didn't understand Pacino's character. They wanted everything to be more explicit, not sexually, but narratively. And I feel like that's kind of a misguided.
I think so. I think that's totally off base. And you wouldn't expect that from film critics who have this breadth of knowledge from throughout film history. I almost wonder if it's just that they were so unaccustomed to this subculture that we're talking about that they couldn't, figure it out because it was such a foreign thing to them. But I don't get it, man. I thought that was part of the strength, the ambiguity, Josh. Also, Josh, you mentioned the Golden Raspberries. Don't forget the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards Most Intrusive Musical Score nomination, which again, I'm a big fan of all the music in this one.
I want to win that award one day.
I don't think the Stinkers Bad Movie Awards exist anymore, sadly for Dave, whose ambition is to win one of those.
Jumping back to the Raspberry, like, okay, you don't like the movie, you don't like the screenplay, but are you going to say it's poorly directed? Like, come on, dude.
Yeah, I think this movie is very well directed, actually. Very stylish, very well paced. I mean, I wouldn't have wanted it to be 40 minutes longer because I feel like the pacing is exactly the way that it should be. So certainly disagree. But as we've talked about the Razzies many, many times, and it seems like evident even from the first time, that a lot of what they do is they just grab onto something that has a pop culture reputation of being a disaster, and then they nominate it for all their awards. And that's just kind of how they do things. So Roger Ebert, in his written review, said, "There is a large, loud question right at the center of Cruising. And because the movie lacks the courage to answer it, what could have been a powerful film dissipates its force and leaves us feeling merely confused and annoyed. The question is, how does the hero of this film, an undercover New York policeman, ultimately really feel about the world of homosexual sadomasochistic sex he is assigned to infiltrate? Here's a movie that's well visualized, that does a riveting job of exploring an authentic subculture, that has a fairly high level of genuine suspense from beginning to end, and that then seems to make a conscious decision not to declare itself on its central subject. What does Friedkin finally think his movie is about?"
Again, we've already said, I think that's, in a way, no pun intended, a cop-out. Because this movie's about cops there, Josh. But also, like, I get it. You want clarity of character and stuff like that. But so many movies leave you asking questions that in a good way. And this is one of them. And this character is entering a world that he doesn't know. And he's having to deal with all of this, the new situations, new feelings, new emotions, whatever it is. So maybe he doesn't have that clarity to answer the question.
Right. And again, as you said, I'm sure Ebert has seen many movies with narrative ambiguity that he praised. And so I don't understand why he can't wrap his head around this.
I need to know how you feel about gay people right now.
Right. And again, it's not just him. He was kinder to the film than Siskel. Siskel was just completely dismissed it. But a lot of the critics really talk about the same kind of thing. So Frank Rich in Time magazine said, "Is the uproar justified? Not entirely. True, Friedkin is up to his usual grisly tricks. The killings are gruesome, and the simulation of S&M couplings will appall many moviegoers of all sexual persuasions. Yet Cruising is not anti-gay, any more than a film like American Gigolo is anti-heterosexual. Friedkin repeatedly, even tediously, reminds the audience that the S&M crowd is but a small, atypical subculture within a diverse homosexual world. The real problem with Cruising is Friedkin's inability to deliver what should have been a brilliant thriller about sex and death. This film muffles a potentially explosive premise. Though Cruising may go too far for some audiences as it fails as a film by refusing to go far enough." And again, I think he just doesn't get it, or he wants his hand held the whole time.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how would that work, Josh? You write movie reviews. How would that work? What is the ending they want? They want him to just say, like, "Here's what I think now that I've been to all these clubs," right? Is that what they want?
I think they want Foghorn Leghorn in the movie.
I mean, that's not that. Well, sometimes he's over here. But I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
yes.
Yeah, I don't know, man. Especially, and you're talking about Friedkin and Pacino. It's not like Pacino was taking risks around, like, all through this time, the 70s through 80s. Like, I don't think these are the guys you hire to make it a play it safe, paint by numbers movie.
Right. I guess what they want is like a police procedural that tells you exactly who the killer is, why they did it, how they did it, walks you through all the evidence, and then, maybe has Pacino's character at the end, give a speech to his girlfriend saying, this is what I learned from this experience. But that's crazy, because I guarantee you that's not what film critics, even in 1980, wanted out of films.
Well, right. That's what I think is so so wild, and also that you had a chance to do Pacino and you just totally avoided it. That was a real bummer.
I am not. I know, as I think we talked about, what is it, our last episode or 2 episodes ago when I was talking about Woody Allen, I know when to not attempt any of these things because I will fail.
But it's so, I think you're right, Josh, that like they're going against stuff that they've rallied for probably in other movies. And that's what is mind boggling to me.
Yeah, I agree. And it's across the board. It's not just one person. It wasn't just Siskel or Ebert or whatever. It's really across the board, including Charles Champlin in the LA Times, who said, the movie, which Friedkin wrote himself, freely adapting a 1970 novel of the same name by Gerald Walker, arrives amid such outrage and controversy that it will probably be difficult for anyone, gay or straight, to view it coolly on its own terms as a movie. No one is likely to find the contents anything but gamey, sordid, shocking, and profoundly depressing. The problem is in a script that never seems sure enough what it wants to say or prove. What it is baffling, vague, and deliberately misleading about its own contents. And with so little real perception provided, Cruising lends itself to the charge of voyeurism that the homosexual community brings against it. It is at that point that the community anger and the film's aesthetic shortcomings and critical disappointments are joined.
Do you think there's any chance that these critics were kind of playing it safe because they saw the gay community revolting against this movie, and so they didn't want to anger, that community? I can't figure it out either. I mean,
I would guess not in 1980.
Right. I was going to say that as well, that in 1980, angering the gay community was probably not something that most people worried about.
They weren't worried about it. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like, this is what, a decade and change after Stonewall, right? And then, we know the AIDS epidemic was hitting, and the first cases of with a name, AIDS and HIV was around this time. And there were these real killings and obviously homophobia. So there's all these combustible elements, but I just think, I don't think he did anything maliciously or even on screen that portrayed this as a malicious kind of hit job on that community.
No, not at all. And I mean, I think to give these people credit, maybe in the mainstream of society, offending the gay community was not a thing that people were concerned about in 1980, but among media elites and open-minded liberals, as I'm sure these people were, I would imagine they were more conscious of being sensitive. And it is possible that they were concerned about that, especially given the vitriol that had been directed against the movie. Maybe they didn't want to feel that vitriol directed against them. Maybe so. Sure.
I mean, this even had like a warning on the theatrical version. The version we saw didn't have the warning. I didn't. Right. Did yours?
No. I watched it on DVD and it did not have that.
But it was basically a warning saying, hey, we're not portraying an entire community, just a subculture, a very specific sect, right? And Pacino said it's just a fragment of the gay community, the same way the mafia is a fragment of Italian American life.
Right. And even without that disclaimer, I mean, there's moments in the movie that Paul Sorvino's character, the captain who assigns Steve to this case, specifically says, this isn't mainstream gay life. This is another thing. So even the characters are telling us that aspect. So, and that whole example about Italians and The Godfather is actually something that Gene Siskel brings up on that Siskel and Ebert segment. And he also, I mean, to go back to what we were saying before, like in that segment, Gene Siskel basically says, like, if homosexuals object to this, that's their business. Like, I don't care. I mean, he doesn't say I don't care, but he essentially says I don't care. That all he cares about is whether the movie works as a movie, and he thinks that it doesn't.
Yeah, some of the things we read is that some of the protesters were like pointing mirrors from rooftops to mess up the light, blasting whistles and air horns and playing music and just trying to shut down the production before it even, got off the ground.
Right. And they did supposedly have to use a lot of ADR because a lot of the sound on location was unusable. Although I feel like it comes off. It didn't bother me, or it didn't seem like it was awkward or anything like that. So as we've said, we none of us had seen this movie before, but had been curious about it. So we got the chance to see it for the first time here. And anything else you want to offer on the background, Jason?
First movie to ever shoot in a city morgue.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. Huh. And Ed O'Neill's
morgue,
film.
Of course, the name of a gay club. Sorry.
Yeah. Hey, why not? So, it's
Could be. Is Ed O'Neill's first film?
Yeah, that's kind of fun. So
yeah, it was a precursor of Al Bundy
and Dutch. And
Yeah.
Josh, you had mentioned how he used Paul Bateson as a consultant. Also, Randy Jurgensen and Sonny Grosso, who were detectives, were film consultants and had long, successful careers. So, like, I feel like this dude is really trying to do good work here. Maybe now you would have a consultant, obviously, from the community, which you're portraying. But I think he said, like, he went to the clubs. Pacino went to these clubs, and I'm sure he did talk to some gay authors and everything like that. So I don't know, man.
Yeah, I think he's making an effort. And even if he didn't have someone specifically as a consultant from that community, the fact that he shot in those clubs with real patrons of those clubs, that gives that authenticity. I'm sure for background action, he just told them, hey, do what you would do if you were at this club normally. And that gives it that level of authenticity.
Let's ramrod.
Or we'll come back in a moment and talk about our general thoughts on Cruising. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1980, we are talking about our future cult classic pick, William Friedkin's Cruising. And in a little bit, we will be talking to our friend Mike Pravat, gay film critic and Las Vegas media fixture, who will offer us some additional perspective. But first, we're going to give our thoughts on this film. And I think what's good, you never know with these cult movies, but we all liked this movie. I think that's good that coming to it, we all really appreciated what Friedkin is attempting to do here.
Right. And it does in some ways harken back to like French Connection. He's really able to build tension and kind of set a mood. And he's a master of those like kind of cops finding, and solving the mystery, So I think some of that was all great. Obviously, Pacino at this point in time really didn't miss at all, I don't think, in any film, around this point in time. And as you know, I thought the soundtrack just really, really set a great atmosphere, mood, whatever you want to call it, but really enhanced what we were going for.
Yeah, that kind of punk or proto new wave music that they use really gives you that sense of being in the New York underground in a way that a more traditional score would definitely not do that.
Yeah, but it's all very dude, masculine, kind of. It even gets into a sub or subsect than that, Josh.
Right. And I think interestingly, also another thing that a lot of reviewers complained about was that Pacino was like too masculine. And I think these reviewers seem to have a very limited understanding that gay people could not be masculine, gay men could not be masculine or butch or whatever. And they can't wrap their head around somebody who might have gay feelings and is not like, effeminate or whatever. So really a very limited understanding.
Yeah, again, 1980, obviously, I think we've all come a long way, hopefully, as people since then. But what's more surprising is that William Friedkin trashed Pacino's performance in a lot of the research I uncovered.
Oh.
He said he was unprofessional. He didn't bring any ideas to the whole thing. It was very strange. It just seems like he didn't like it. And then, now watching it, he's like, he says now he can see the good in Pacino's performance. But there was, one scene where he fights James Remar's character, the neighbor's like boyfriend. And he said, that's the only scene where I let Pacino cut loose and do a Pacino. But like, Pacino was he wasn't just all like pomp and circumstance, especially in the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of building to his characters.
Right. And I think it's refreshing now, since we've endured so many years of cartoonish Pacino, to go back to these early roles and see how much nuance and subtlety he used to be able to bring to his performances. I like seeing him in his subdued sort of mode. And I think that works really well in this film. And I think you can maybe separate Friedkin's complaints of like on-set behavior and not being professional and not being collaborative with the results that are on screen, which even Friedkin, like you said, can acknowledge that are good. I think Pacino is good in this movie, and I think he contributes a lot. Like, maybe it doesn't give you every single explicit character beat like some of these critics wanted, but I think you get a sense of this guy and a lot of the sense of his uncertainty as he goes into this world and is sort of figuring himself out in the process. So I like Pacino's performance, and the fact that he doesn't cut loose except in that one scene gives you it makes an impact. You're like, oh, wow, he really is angry about this. He really cares about this because he's going so harsh where he isn't in any other moment.
Josh, the other thing is like all of the character and what he discovers is motivated by his dedication to the assignment, to the work. And I thought that, you keep seeing that in different ways. And, whether it's when he gets upset about the treatment of a suspect that they basically just beat up because he's gay and they want a confession, or before that, when he wants that guy to tie him up. And, it's just, again, I think it's a pretty damn good performance. I don't know what the complaints would be.
Right. I agree that it is quite a good performance, and that part of the movie's even-handed depiction of the gay community comes from his performance, that he doesn't spend the movie seeming like a guy who is afraid of gay people or hates gay people or thinks they're crazy freaks or whatever. He's always open to like, I'm going to do what's necessary to solve this crime. And these people deserve justice just like anyone else does. And maybe it shows him some things about himself that he's not entirely comfortable with, but that's on him and not on those other people.
So Josh, Richard Gere was Friedkin's first choice, who obviously was playing a lot of these kind of sexually explorative parts around this time. De Niro, Jeff Bridges, Roy Scheider, Timothy Bottoms were the other names I read.
Oh, yeah. I mean, some of those could have been good. I feel like Richard Gere could have been good, but Pacino
Jeff Bridges would
really
have been interesting.
Yeah. I don't know if De Niro could have, he probably wouldn't have been right for this.
I mean, but in one way, the fact that there is such a machismo to Pacino and that kind of masculinity is similar to De Niro, especially at this time, like that really kind of worked for the character.
Yeah, I do think, contrary to what those critics are saying, I think having the machismo and the masculinity in the character is good. And that someone like Jeff Bridges or Richard Gere, who are a little more androgynous, to use the word correctly, might not have fit.
Josh, you did not use that word ambiguously at all, did you?
No, man.
The
vocabulary.
And then from a directing standpoint, Brian De Palma was once attached, which makes sense. But the one that was surprising was Steven Spielberg was trying to develop this movie in the 70s. And that would have been a whimsical take on a mass killer of a subsect, huh?
Yeah, I don't think Spielberg would have been right for this. De Palma could have done something interesting. And there are some scenes, especially like the first murder scene with the like flashes of the knife stabbing and like close-ups, that felt very De Palma-esque to me. And there's also a clear like giallo influence, Italian horror movies and that kind of stuff. And the ambiguity of the ending and the general ambiguity of like, who is the killer and is the killer like society is very giallo-esque. And I don't know, again, maybe that's something that these critics just didn't know or notice at the time in 1980.
Well, they wanted answers, but it seems like Friedkin had a clear vision of the questions that he wanted answered and didn't want answered.
Right. And I think also, I mean, not to just jump to the ending again, which we'll talk about again later, but I think if you are so determined for there to be an answer, you can easily just accept the answer that's given at one point in the movie. Here's the killer. We see flashbacks of him targeting people. We have a reason because, he's gay, but his father didn't approve and he's sort of torn about that. And you can just accept that if that's what you want, and have the rest of the stuff be just sort of atmosphere. But I guess that wasn't good enough.
Did you have an answer, or were you happy leaving it ambiguous?
I'm happy to leave it ambiguous. I mean, I do like that. And I didn't feel like it was so frustrating because, again, there's an answer there if you want it. I didn't feel like it was just nothing. Like, for example, to pick a movie that we talked about a couple seasons ago that's very ambiguous and artsy and that sets up a mystery and then just kind of throws its hands up, in Blow Up, where I think that was a frustrating thing for all of us as viewers because it doesn't even attempt it. I think here it's a good balance because you get an answer, you can take that answer, but you can also ponder the idea that maybe that answer isn't as definitive as the characters want it to be.
Dave, anything here, Dave? Want to jump in, Dave? Dave, you got something for us, Dave?
I'll just throw in that ambiguity is great because specifically about the way Al Pacino is playing this. I mean, this character going into this world and not really knowing how it's affecting him 100%, should leave everything in the dark. So it's kind of perfect, I think.
Right. And you can read that final shot of him. I think some people read it as a hint that he could be the killer, but I don't think it has to be that far. You can just read it as like, here's a guy who went through this very intense experience that he's still processing and doesn't quite understand how it affected him.
Yeah, and that's what I took from it. But I'm just a dumb straight white guy.
Right. You sure are, Jason.
So Josh, should we just come back now and let our smarter friend Mike Pravat jump in here?
Well, I think maybe first you want to rate the movie before we get to that.
Sure.
Give it a rating out of 5.
5 ramrods?
Daddies. 5 ramrods. Sure. Let's do it.
I was going to say those bandanas that you hang out of your pocket.
Yeah.
Ramrod is the name of a bar here. Also, an incredible Bruce Springsteen song, as you both know.
Oh, thank goodness we got a Springsteen reference in there.
Yeah,
Yeah, Dave, we could rate it out of those bandanas. I was amazed at the complexity of the bandana system and wondered if that was like all real, because you really had to have like a chart to make sure that you knew which bandana, which side it was on, because the same color on a different side could mean something different. And I assume that was real. But to me, I was just like, man, this would be a lot to keep track of.
That seemed real.
I heard of this wasn't the first time I've heard that before. So I think it is real.
Same here.
Yeah.
I think you're right, but it was a little much. So
5 colored
5
bandanas.
ramrods. No, Jason, you love the ramrod, so let's do the ramrods.
All right, Josh, I give it 3.5 ramrods, 3 ramrods and a ram, because I think it's a really effective film with excellent performance and music, and it's worth seeking out this one.
Yeah, I agree. I also give it 3.5 ramrods, and I think it's got great atmosphere, solid performance, and it is suspenseful, as even Roger Ebert acknowledges there in his somewhat negative review. So, some aspects are outdated, but I feel like not as many as other movies that are not about such a controversial subject that we talk about from the movie.
Right,
so.
and more modern too. So
right.
Hey Josh, if your half is a rod, then we have one more full ramrod.
I don't even want to go there. So, Dave, how do you want to rate this?
I'll go up to 4 for me.
All right.
This movie was a total vibe. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it really does. It has that vibe. The atmosphere is really effective. It really draws you into that world, which I think is important because it's drawing the main character into that world as well.
Exactly.
So we will come back and talk to Mike Pravat, who will give us some more insights on cruising. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1980, we have been talking about our future cult classic pick, William Friedkin's Cruising. And we are happy to be joined by a guest here. We are talking to Mike Pravat, who is a producer at KNPR here in Las Vegas, as well as a former film critic, I guess we would say, for Las Vegas City Life, and my former coworker from Las Vegas Weekly. So, Mike, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and he's edited a lot of my work over some years as well.
That's right.
Yeah, we've all worked together various periods of time. So we're happy to have Mike offer a perspective beyond our privileged perches, I guess you could say, that Jason and I are on.
Yes. We thought it was important to have a gay perspective, someone of the community. Josh and I are just two white dudes who are living the high life, because we're straight white guys, Mike. We needed some help here.
Thank you for clarifying that, Jason. Mike looks happy. So Mike, I know this is actually a movie that you hadn't seen. You said you watched this for the sake of talking to us, but what was your impression of it? Like, how did you first hear about it? And what was your awareness of this movie prior to this?
I've known about the movie for a long time. It was just one of any number of movies that any of us have that they sort of languish at the bottom of our, our streaming queues, or we just, don't prioritize it. In fact, I think it was on Criterion not too long ago. And I think I had it in the queue, and then they took it off. So this was a good excuse to see it. I don't know. I think I have not really dug deep into the gay films of the early 80s or the 70s for whatever reason. The only one I can think of off the top of my head that I've seen was another Al Pacino movie, which was Dog Day Afternoon. And so this was, I was sort of due to see it. I didn't know a whole lot about its backstory, so I wasn't deterred based on, what I had what I've now recently heard about it or read about it. And my impressions of it were that, I liked the movie generally. I like Friedkin. I love The Exorcist. He did French Connection, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So both of those are great movies. And watching it, I could get the sense that he was the filmmaker. I definitely saw the stylistic overlap. And, I had a lot of different, thoughts going through it, how it might have been perceived at the time, how I was perceiving it. I felt moments of, tension during those tense scenes where you didn't know what was going to happen. The ending was a bit intriguing. I had to kind of think about it for a bit, and then I read about it to see if my thoughts matched what other people, thought about in terms of the ending. So I thought was, possibly a movie that I could even return to, just to see what I missed the first time around, which is always a good sign when I'm watching a movie at the end being like, oh, I'm going to have to see that at some point again.
Yeah, absolutely. So this isn't something that you remember people telling you, I don't know, maybe like to stay away from, or this is not something that you want to subject yourself to, or anything like that.
No, in fact, I know they talk about it in the book, The Celluloid Closet, which explores LGBT movies. And I have still not read that book. That would have been my only exposure to, hey, this film had, and at least at the time, had a negative reception. But I'm glad I did not know that. And now that I've seen it and I've read how it was negatively received, its negative reception happened before the movie even came out. And that was sort of interesting. I mean, I understand the how should we put it, the gut reaction to knowing that something like this was coming out. This is right when AIDS had popped up. And, on top of all the other stigma that gay people were experiencing, we had then this to make us look even worse. And for a movie to sort of glorify how gay people sought out sex, and then how, there were murderers among our tribe on top of it, I could see why it was definitely not a good look. But, now that we're 42 years on, we can definitely look at it at a different lens. I think that me finally watching it now as opposed to earlier, I got to benefit from that.
It seems like we all liked it. You felt the same way, Mike?
Yeah, I did.
Was there anything in it as you were watching it now that you felt like, oh, this is potentially harmful or offensive? Or do you feel like a lot of that has really faded?
I mean, I think a lot of that has faded. I will say this, there's that first scene where he finally walks into a gay club after he takes the assignment. And, you're getting quite an eyeful of, the realities of a leather bar. I mean, you walk into the garage near UNLV here in Las Vegas, and it's a pretty benign sight. But if you, go, we have some semblance of a leather bar here, the Fun Hog Ranch, and it might be a little edgier compared to, say, the garage. It's still nothing like what you see in cruising, but, sites like that, they exist in certain cities and certain parties. And even me as a 46-year-old man who has been out of the closet since he was 22, 23 years old, I will still walk into a bar or a party like that. And I might still go, okay, here we go. And I can only imagine what straight people who know nothing about that culture or have never seen anything like that would see. You do get the feeling that like Friedkin and the producers were like, let's give them a look at what happens. And so there's a little bit of a sensationalistic gaze and projection in the movie that, might be a little cynical, but it is truthful. There's nothing I haven't seen in that movie. And from what I understand, the more neutered version of what they originally wanted. I was queasy insofar that maybe I wasn't expecting it to be as accurate or in some cases as graphic. I think just my anticipation of like, oh, this is a movie in 1980, how much are they really going to show? And then being like, oh,
Right.
okay, we're going there.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, my level of surprise. I don't think anything seemed offensive. I mean, it was disturbing to see the cops give gay guys a hard time, but, in 1970s New York, that happened too. So,
Sure.
it's more like, here's what happened. Unfortunately, we're showing this now to straight people. From there, what happens when the audience receives it? Who knows? Again, I understand the sensitivities of it, but this was a much bigger issue. And I don't know if you guys have discussed this at any point in the podcast, but in 1991 and 1992, we had two monstrously huge movies that had gay serial killers in them: Silence of the Lambs and Basic Instinct. And those had a bigger media reach in terms of controversy. And those were definitely more sensitive times for the LGBT community because we were in the peak of AIDS. And, we were, much more aware of how gay people were being discriminated against and what we didn't have compared to straight people. And, the whole thing was blown much bigger. And in this movie, in comparison, I think, given that you're dealing with a subculture and you're dealing with something that was a true story compared to these, I know Basic Instinct was fictional. I don't remember if Silence of the Lambs had any basis in.
I think this is based on a novel, maybe partially inspired by a true story, but I don't know, like specifically true necessarily.
Right. Are you talking about Cruising, or are you talking about
Cruising? Yeah.
There was a journalist. I think he worked for the Village Voice, and there was some basis in it.
Right, but heavily fictionalized, and
Right.
If those other movies are inspired by true stories, it's probably the same deal. It's sort of a jumping off point.
Sure. Probably even more so.
Hey, Mike, you mentioned Dog Day Afternoon, which is another great movie. Is there because, when you think of maybe icons or actors that are revered in the gay community, you don't really hear like Al Pacino, but he was taking on these roles that would be risky for a mainstream leading man in the 70s and 1980 here. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have never really read anything that celebrated his bravery. When I was watching the movie, I did finally think of that. I didn't think about it beforehand. And then something triggered me. And I was like, oh, yeah, not only was he in Dog Day Afternoon in 75, but then going forward, was it 30 years later, he's Roy Cohn in Angels in America, which obviously he's playing a pretty bad guy. I mean, just in terms of gay American history, one of the most evil people that the LGBT community have ever had to deal with. But he is nonetheless playing a gay man. He's playing someone who's suffering from AIDS. He is dealing with he's dealing with other gay characters. And I'm not sure that there are any, I can't think of off the top of my head another straight actor who has done that many gay roles. I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah, and especially Jason, as you're saying, I mean, it's maybe by the time he got around to playing Roy Cohn, it was more of a this is a way that straight actors get awards. But in the 70s and the early 80s, it was certainly a lot bigger of a risk.
Well, and you're talking about Dog Day where, they're robbing a bank and, spoiler alert coming. It's to pay for his lover's transition, right? Which is pretty amazing back then. And then I thought Cruising did a really good job. Like you said, the police took advantage of, some of the gay characters. But as far as the Pacino character, just straight down honest, doing the work in a non-judgmental way.
Yeah. Judgmental, I think, is something that we expect from depiction of gay culture in this era. But I kind of felt the same way as Jason did about it. Did it seem that way to you also?
As far as Pacino goes, I was definitely cluing in on when he got the assignment from the Paul Sorvino character. And he just was kind of like, yeah, sure, let's do it, And he wasn't even that, you can imagine that a heterosexual man in the late 70s, early 80s, when he's being asked, hey, have you ever had sex with a man? And Pacino's like, no. He wasn't like, are you kidding? What are you talking about? Why are you asking this? Like, he doesn't have the overreaction you can imagine happening. So it's weird because in the movie, he's oddly aloof the whole time. And you're like, is this Pacino playing him as aloof? Is he being self-conscious? Is this what the role requires? Is this what a detective has to do when he's undercover? He's mostly aloof through the whole thing. But then there are times where like he really gets into it. He puts the makeup in his eyebrows. He seems all too willing to have men, come to the hotel room and tie him up. And, there's all kinds of different, there's kind of his role with in terms of the projection of his sexuality. You could say at some points it's low and he's lifting weights probably to seem more macho and being more aggressive with his girlfriend. And then there's other times where he's going for it and he doesn't have the self-consciousness while he's working. It seems like he really wants to solve the crime. He really wants to get ahead as a detective. And also the way he talks with the other gay characters, doesn't seem like he's really struggling to relate to them or speak to them. And I think it's a pretty measured performance and maybe what a role like that would require.
Yeah. I want to go back to something else that you said that, sort of to your knowledge, and I realize you were a child during the time period when this takes place, but that, to your knowledge, to whatever degree you have, that there's accuracy in the depiction of this particular subculture in this film. So do you feel that way? And I mean, I don't know how familiar you are particularly with it, if you want to go into that at all.
Well, from what I know, I mean, for the most part, nothing struck me as egregious. Like I said earlier, I have walked into leather bars before, and the artwork on the wall tends to be graphic. The flirting that happens, some of the things happening in the corners looks like they're things that, maybe wouldn't happen in, at PT's place. And
might make it more interesting though.
Oh,
we could go to PTs and catch some.
I would resubscribe for my PT's place membership if that were the case.
Your player's card, yeah.
So the scenes where the men dressed up, they were androgynous or even presenting as women. Their interactions, they didn't seem out of place. The costuming was right on. It felt like someone had done their homework. I don't know if they were dealing with people who were gay or they were just very observant. I think there was I think I read that they did some intel and research in some of the other gay bars where they weren't being kicked out. And it felt authentic, from what I know. I was obviously, like you said, I wasn't in bars at that time, but even just what I know of bars today, and even based on descriptions I have read in books from people who were of the time, like I read a John Rishi book. He was a hustler around that time, and it seemed to be in concert with everything that I've read and that I knew.
So, Mike, you and I mean, we all kind of got to know each other, and I know you used to do film reviews, but you and I mostly got to know each other on the music scene out here. First, writing for opposite weeklies, but then you edited a lot of my articles. And I wanted to talk to you. I was really excited as I was watching this by the soundtrack and how effective it was. And I wanted you to, it was so macho and like just set such a mood. I wanted to just get your opinion on the soundtrack of this thing.
Yeah, I was actually taken aback. I did not know what the soundtrack of leather bars were in this. I think it depicts. I think it doesn't depict 1980 necessarily, but it's sometime in the 70s or late 70s.
Yeah, some slightly earlier. Yeah,
right. And my assumption of a gay bar in New York City in the West Village is probably going to be disco or the precursors to house or something more mainstream. And, you go into those kind of bars now and you're not hearing the most alternative of music. But then it sounds like you were. And I actually it gave the movies, first of all, some energy. some different kind of energy. It wasn't dour, downbeat music. It was kind of, it had an enervating feel to it, but it was also edgy. And I think I read that this was the first time the Germs had ever had music in a movie before, which I'm sure, compared to now with, licensing and everything, I'm sure back then that was, not happening very often to begin with. But I liked the fact that the music went in another direction. The more macho feel of the music, as you put it, definitely matches what vibe that those bars want to give off. There's this thing in the gay community, even to this day, where marketing people, they always prefer a more masculine form of advertising, of marketing, of projection, because there's still the stigma with a more male effeminate representation. And in those bars, you really see that in play. Like they want manly men, leather, denim, Levi, and sometimes they'll call it a leather Levi bar. That usually plays into it. You have your harnesses, things that definitely project something more manly. And sometimes it's a reaction to mainstream society. Sometimes it's a reaction to effeminate gay men. You can look at it a bunch of different ways, but the music definitely paired with what, that culture is like.
Do you want to talk about the ending, Mike? And you seem to have some thoughts on it. It's ambiguous / potentially controversial. How did you interpret it?
So as I was watching it, I felt at first that, okay, they've caught the killer. And then we look at the final murder with his neighbor. And then I was like, oh, there's more to the movie. But I thought I only had 5 minutes left in the movie because I did look and see what was left. I'm like, there's going to be some big reveal. And then, of course, you get the final scene of him looking in the mirror as he's shaving. And I was like, oh, have I been had? And I stopped it. I went back and I watched the last 10 minutes again. And I was like, could the neighbor still have been murdered by what I call the Lou Reed lookalike, who was actually the killer?
Yeah.
And I was like, maybe, Friedkin's having some fun with us. And that was still a murder done by the original killer. And then I listened to the commentary track of the last 10 minutes on the DVD that I found.
This guy, what a research machine.
Yeah.
Dude, Las Vegas public library system. I will defend it to my death. It is top. I found a copy of it at Spring Mountain Library. And they had the commentary track of this disc. This DVD is discontinued. You can't buy it anywhere unless it's used. And Friedkin gives a very, he's basically walking you through the movie. He is not doing what a lot of filmmakers do, which is kind of reflect and expound upon and kind of really go into different aspects of what they were thinking during the movie. He kind of gives you the play-by-play more than the color. And he gives just enough color to make you even more confused or more, to make you think more openly about what happened. But then he also zeroes in on the cop. And the cop who's at the scene of the crime when the neighbor is killed. The cop who, of course, is in the cop car in the very beginning scene where they, to put it mildly, harass the two streetwalkers, and is also in the gay bar in the middle of the movie. And then I'm like, you fucker. I was like, that is now 3 people I've got to think about as to what happened. And I'm like, kind of a masterstroke. I like ambiguous endings. I will, I'm a big defender of the final Sopranos episode. And I like movies that kind of make you think a little bit and give you it almost treats it like a poem, that you can interpret in a bunch of different ways. So, that was smart. It at first a little frustrating, but, I caught on to it.
Well, I think got to add his lover in there too.
Right. They,
yes.
So 4. Really.
Yeah. I forgot about him. Right. Yeah. That's
right. A lot going on there.
Can you talk about, because we talked about, kind of what the backlash was before this came out. Can you talk about the reassessment of it and maybe where it stands today?
So from what little I read on that, I see a bunch of pieces that have come out from people, including gay people, defending the movie. And, first of all, a lot of time has passed. It's easier to reassess these things. Look, Birth of a Nation will never get this kind of treatment, as it should not. But I think with a lot of other movies that seemed controversial at the time, sometimes time will pass and you realize that sometimes there are overreactions or sometimes it is just a product of circumstance. Again, super sensitive, vulnerable gay community in 1980. We're hearing about gay cancer, that gay men are passing, and it's just one more thing for, straight people who don't like gay people to attack us with. And we're just, the community's like, just one more thing we have to contend with. And so they're going to be super sensitive. And I get it. Now HIV is a much different beast than it was in 1980, 1991, 92, even the year 2000. So I'm kind of glad the movie is getting reassessed. I mean, if this was some crappy gay movie, it wouldn't make a difference, obviously. But because it is, I think, a quality film that was made pretty intelligently, from what I can tell, pretty carefully, and they were very adamant at the time, like, look, we're not targeting the gay community. This is just, loosely based on something that happened, and we want to tell the story, and it's going to be unique. I mean, this film definitely comes out of that 70s filmmaking tradition. I think it's the different lens that we are now afforded to look at it with that allows the reassessment, that allows us to kind of look at it at a more comfortable perch.
I think we're going to wrap up here, but do you have any final observations you want to share, Mike?
What I wanted to ask you, with that in mind, does it feel like a weight off your shoulder? Because you said, you've always had it on your queue and, it was in the drawer or whatever. And now you finally watched it, Mike. Does it feel good to have that checked off the list?
I've never felt that sense of relief for a movie I finally got to, unless I was being harassed about watching it finally. So not quite like that, but I will update my LGBTQ list on my letterbox with the movie now. Excellent. Because I am glad I saw it. I will say this. The first thing real quick about final observations is I read that there were 40 minutes of the movie that they had to excise to get the R rating. And my first thought was, where is the special edition director's cut DVD? Right. And then I read the bad news that that's not coming anytime soon. So that's a bummer, because I wonder what that footage reveals. I wonder if in that footage, does it redeem the film any further, or does it perhaps stigmatize the film any further? I'm very curious about that. The second thing is, in terms of demonizing gay people, Al Pacino himself had a very good quote that I saw somewhere on the internet that really puts this in perspective. And he said, "This film doesn't stigmatize the LGBT community any more than movies about the mafia stigmatize Italian Americans." Which, it's a great quote, and it comes from a great source. And I think that really sort of signifies where that movie can stand. And frankly speaking, I have seen my fair share of gay movies made by gay filmmakers, put out through gay studios, that I sat through, groaned and grimaced, and thought these are the most stereotypical, awful, playing the stereotype movies I have ever seen, that are far more offensive than anything I saw in Cruising. So that's my final thought on it.
I'm really glad that we all kind of feel the same way, and that also, this is one that's worth rediscovering. If you've heard of it, or if maybe you've never heard of it, this is one worth seeking out.
Yeah. So, Mike, thanks again for joining us. Do you have anything you want to plug? Where can people see you on social media or check out your work?
So most of my work right now resides at knpr.org, where I work. My Twitter account is Mike Pravat, spelled just like my name is, wherever you're looking at it on your phone or computer. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you again, Mike, for joining us. And we'll come back in a moment and talk more about the legacy of Cruising. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 1980, we have been talking about our future cult classic pick, Cruising. And thank you again to Mike Pravat for all of his insights, hopefully better than ours. But, you know, we do our best.
Mike Pravat coming with some hammers there, Josh. He's did a lot of research, put a lot of thought into it. And it was his first time seeing this too. So pretty cool that we got to have that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. We do appreciate all that. We try to do our research, but Mike went above and beyond there. So, we can put him in the Awesome Movie Year Guest Appearance Hall of Fame.
That's a very, even if we put all of our guests in there, it's still a very small hall
right.
of fame.
Yeah, that's, I think, my implication there. Every one of them is in there. All of the guests that we've had. Anyway, we are here talking about now the legacy of Cruising. And, we talked a bit about it with Mike and about the way that the movie has been reassessed in the gay community. And I think that's a really major part of it, that not that some people still don't dislike this movie or still find it offensive or harmful, but the number, it seems like, of people who feel that way has really dwindled, and that there's gotten to be a lot more support from gay critics who would see it now.
And I think that all critics and all film watchers, Friedkin says it could be found wanting as a film, but it no longer has to undergo the stigma of being an anti-gay screed, which it never was.
Right. I mean, and I think the thing we've been sort of harsh on those judgments, but I think one thing that I can kind of understand, and this goes to the passage of time, that now in 2022, we have, if not enough, certainly far more varied representations of gay life in films and in TV series. And in 1980, there were very few. And so if one of the only representations of the community is going to be this movie about this sort of freakish subculture that includes a serial killer, I can understand at that time for people saying, we don't want one of the only ways that mainstream society is aware of us to be this. And now that's not the case, and so it's different.
Yeah, I guess, but that seems prejudice against a certain group within the group.
Well, right. I mean, it is, I suppose, yes, that is true, that there's no reason to be judgmental about that S&M scene, the leather bars or whatever. I think maybe more so about the idea that it's about a gay serial killer who is, acting out his own sort of internalized homophobia.
Yeah, and I do think that might have been the weakest part of the film, was the, when we finally see that Stewart character and him having these flashbacks to his father, and if they are kind of not justifying, but giving you the motivation for his actions. I don't know. That one didn't feel as really well drawn as the rest of the film from a character standpoint.
Yeah, I agree. And I think especially the gay person who acts out because of internalized homophobia has become sort of a cliche in films and in TV series, but it maybe, it wasn't something that was as prevalent at this time. But I agree with you about that. On the other hand, obviously that was what a lot of critics wanted, was just a basic, clear explanation of this, even if it was dissatisfying.
Josh, it would have been, we've talked about 1977 and, William Friedkin, one of the major figures of New Hollywood, won, almost every Oscar, Best Picture, Director, Actor, Screenplay, and Editing for The French Connection, I think in 71. Got a DGA Award, a Golden Globe, some of the other movies, The Exorcist, To Live and Die in L.A., and then the last one, The Devil and Father Amorth. Did you ever see that, Josh?
And that's a documentary about someone, I think, who was a consultant on The Exorcist, I want to say. So I never saw
him
that.
Going to perform exorcisms. They film these live exorcisms.
Right. It was a very poorly reviewed film. The last narrative film he made was Killer Joe in 2011, which I've also not seen, and was kind of controversial for being very explicit. The most recent Friedkin film I've seen is Bug with Ashley Judd and Michael Shannon, which I think is one of the movies that got an F cinema score. One of these movies that was very, very off-putting to audiences, but I think it's a really fascinating film and has also been kind of reassessed and appreciated in years since. And
Josh, I will tell you, he directed the best Shaquille O'Neal movie, Blue Chips, from the mid-90s. That's a good basketball movie there.
I've not seen Blue Chips or To Live and Die in L.A., which is, along with, I think, The French Connection and The Exorcist, one of his like major films, and I'd like to check that out.
I love me some French Connection, Josh.
Yeah, and The Exorcist is great. I was lucky enough to get to see The Exorcist on a big screen one time in a theater, and that's a really cool theatrical experience to have. And Friedkin is still, I mean, he's in his 80s, but he's still around, and he could very well come back and make something interesting. He seems like the kind of person who would continue pushing his boundaries.
Also in his 80s, Al Pacino, who's as busy as ever, one of the most celebrated and awarded actors of all time. As we mentioned, he won the Oscar for Scent of a Woman, 9 Oscar nods. He's got 2 movies in the works. He was in House of Gucci last year. Sniff sounds kind of, not going to say the same, but of this, maybe could be, it's a Taylor Hackford movie, so it's not going to be as moody, let's say, but it's a retired detective is pulled back into action by his former partner, and they uncover a hidden underworld of sex, drugs, and murders in the wealthy community controlled by the kingpin Harvey Stride and his femme fatale enforcer.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly not giving a lot of credence to whatever Al Pacino chooses to do now.
He's playing King Lear coming up, and we know he has a history of Shakespeare work and acclaimed Shakespeare work.
Yeah, and I mean, even though he has become sort of a cartoon, he can still pull out some good performances, certainly. I mean, even, later in his career, I guess it's a long time ago now, but, by the 90s, he was already kind of in this ridiculous mode. But I really like him in Donnie Brasco and in The Insider, and even some of his crazy over the topness. Like, I have a fondness for The Devil's Advocate, which could be like one of the most absurd. God is an absentee landlord. Yeah. It's just over, but it's a super fun movie.
No, those that you mentioned, The Speech in Any Given Sunday. I mean, more recently, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and The Irishman. He kills both of those parts. He was great in them. So, he's not doing what he used to do, but if this is, who he is now, he's making it work on a high level still.
And he's certainly doing exactly what he wants. And I mean, he was like a meme recently because he was like walking down the street, dancing to his music was listening to on his headphones, just like having a great time being Al Pacino. Like, what could be better than that, really? Yeah.
And I would recommend watching Looking for Richard, his somewhat oblique documentary on Shakespeare and how to perform it. It's an interesting film. I don't really know what else to say about it. I don't think I understood it all, but I wouldn't give it a negative review like these bums did in 1980 to Cruising.
Speaking of somewhat oblique artsy documentaries, James Franco in 2014 made a film called Interior Leather Bar that ostensibly is his attempt to recreate what he imagines would be the missing 40 minutes of Cruising. Now, he doesn't actually know what that is because, as we say, Friedkin's never specifically said. The footage itself is lost. If it was in the script, people haven't seen that. And the movie, which I did watch and Dave somehow also endured, is, despite the fact, what struck me is like, despite the fact that that's theoretically the idea that James Franco and Travis Matthews, who's the co-director, they're casting and shooting these scenes that are meant to recreate the bits of Cruising. There's like, 5-10 maybe minutes of that actual footage in the film. And the vast majority of the film is this sort of pseudo, possibly partially scripted documentary about the making of the movie and the concept of it and why do it or why not do it. And it really mainly comes off like Franco and everyone involved don't know what the hell they're doing.
It's a documentary about the making of Interior Leather Bar, not the making of Cruising.
Right, exactly. Right. It's a documentary about the making of itself. And the idea of, no, that's really what it, I mean, and it's one of these very meta, self-reflexive. I think I saw someone on Letterboxd said alternate title, Interior James Franco's Posterior. It's very much like, I think a lot of James Franco's, exactly. A lot of James Franco's directorial efforts is this like conceptual, pretentious thing that's not a movie that you can enjoy watching.
But I mean, for a guy who was a mainstream star for a long time, while he was a mainstream star, to get those movies financed and made, like, Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I respect the idea that he's doing, but the execution of it is almost entirely inept.
Yeah, Josh and I were talking about it, and like the idea is sound, but then watching him attempt to even explain what he's trying to do to these guys that he hired, it's like he clearly doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah, interesting.
Right. And his concept is, I'm James Franco and I can do whatever I want. And that seems the concept of a lot of his movies.
Well, I think we've spoken in our Room episode. The height of him was the disaster artist, but
yeah, and he can be a very entertaining actor, but I think as a sort of his own disaster artist, it's a different story.
Well, Josh, I mean, this film, Cruising, is littered with excellent character actors. Paul Sorvino, mostly known for Goodfellas, I think, as Paulie in Law and Order. Karen Allen, of course, debuted in Animal House and will always be remembered for Indiana Jones. And James Remar, we talked about in The Cotton Club. Check him out in The Warriors, and later he's Sex and the City and Dexter. And Richard Cox, who plays that aforementioned Stuart Richards, has appeared in Looking for Richard and Wild Salome, another Pacino-directed film.
No, I don't think I've seen any of Pacino's directorial efforts, but yeah, a lot of good.
Go watch my movies, man.
I did want to say another secondary character who we didn't really talk about much, but I really like the relationship that Pacino's character has with his neighbor when he sort of moves into this the gay neighborhood, and he has this neighbor who's an aspiring playwright who's not involved in the leather scene and is more the quote mainstream gay scene, and they really form this nice friendship. And that character is played by Don Scardino, who later went on to become a very prolific TV director. And Jason, someone that you know and have worked with, I think. Right?
I haven't worked with him. His father was a pretty famous musician, and my grandfather was a comedian for over 60 years, and they'd always have a band with the comedian. So his father played often in my grandfather's backing band, as far as I understand it, and also was just a fan. And supposedly, I don't know Don, but my grandfather had nothing but nice things to say about both Don Sr. and Don Jr., the Scardinos. Also, Josh, Powers Booth. You talked about the bandanas. Powers Booth played the salesman there. So
yeah, a lot of small parts for people who would go on to very long character acting careers showing up in this film. So anything else you want to mention about the legacy of this film, Jason?
We say
Thank goodness that we ended on that note. So that is Cruising, and that is this episode of Awesome Movie Year. Check us out on social media.
We're on social media. I'm Jason Harris Comedy, or J Harris Comedy on all the socials. My website, Go For Jason, should be arrested for inactivity because it's been so long since I did anything with it. Josh, we're at awesomemovieyear.com. Awesome Movie Year on Facebook and Instagram. Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter. And thank you for all the feedback, as always, everyone.
Yeah, we certainly appreciate it. Hopefully people will have some good things to say about Mike. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at Mike Pravat and check out his work on KNPR here in Las Vegas. You can check me out at joshbellhateseverything.com, at joshbellhateseverything on Facebook, and at Signal Bleed on Twitter. And listen to our producer David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. And don't forget to join our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces.
And speaking of that Facebook group, we had some audience choice voting going on in that group. And so, Jason, what do we have in our next episode?
Josh, it is the audience choice, and it's 1980, a huge year for horror movies. So we let our listeners choose which one of these iconic horror films they wanted us to cover. And the winner is The Fog.
So tune in next time for The Fog, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.